In the autumn of 1818, as the leaves turned golden in Frankfurt, Arthur Schopenhauer sat alone in his study, the manuscript of The World as Will and Representation finally complete. The philosopher's brow furrowed as he gazed out at the quiet street below, watching a young woman hurry past with downcast eyes. There was something in her demeanor that captured his attention, a complexity he had long contemplated but never fully articulated. Professor Elizabeth Caldwell discovered Schopenhauer's private journals quite by accident. While researching for her doctoral thesis at Heidelberg University, she stumbled upon a collection of leather-bound notebooks tucked away in a forgotten archive. The journals contained observations about women's psychology that had never been published. Observations too controversial, too personal, and perhaps too insightful for the philosopher's time. Elizabeth's fingers trembled as she turned the yellowed pages. As an accomplished philosopher herself, she recognized the academic significance of the discovery. But as a woman in the male-dominated field of philosophy, she also felt an unexpected connection to these hidden thoughts. "I've found something," she whispered to herself, "that might change everything we know about Schopenhauer's understanding of human nature." Little did she know that these journals would take her on an intellectual journey that would challenge not only her academic pursuits, but also her understanding of her own complex relationships, desires, and identity. The fundamental error in female character, Elizabeth read aloud from Schopenhauer's journal, is not selfishness, as many claim, but a fascinating contradiction, the simultaneous need for autonomy and connection. The cafe around her hummed with conversation as she sat with her colleague and former lover, Professor James Harrison. Their relationship had ended years ago when their academic paths diverged, yet they maintained an intellectual partnership that sometimes blurred professional boundaries. "It's remarkable," James said, leaning forward. "Schopenhauer is often dismissed as a misogynist, but these private thoughts suggest something more nuanced." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes still on the journal. "He's observing what he perceives as a fundamental tension in human psychology, one he believed was more evident in women because of social constraints. The desire for independence fighting against the desire for deep connection." She closed the book and looked up at James. "It's the same contradiction I've struggled with my entire academic career. The same one that ended our relationship." James's expression shifted, a flash of old pain crossing his features. "You chose your work over us." "I chose both," Elizabeth countered, "but the world wouldn't allow it." As they parted ways outside the cafe, Elizabeth wondered if Schopenhauer's observations about desire and will might help her understand not just her academic subject, but her own life's contradictions. The university lecture hall fell silent as Elizabeth projected Schopenhauer's unpublished writings onto the screen. Her students leaned forward, captivated by her analysis. Schopenhauer believed that all human beings are driven by will, a fundamental force that manifests as desire, ambition, and survival instinct, Elizabeth explained. But in these private writings, he explores how women's expression of will was shaped differently in the 19th century. A student raised her hand. "Professor Caldwell isn't discussing Schopenhauer's views on women problematic given his reputation." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "Absolutely. Many of his public writings contain misogynistic views common in his era. But these private journals reveal something different, an awareness that women's psychology wasn't inherently different from men's, but rather shaped by social constraints." After class, Elizabeth found her department chair, Dean Richardson, waiting outside. "Interesting lecture," he said, his tone measured. "The committee has concerns about your research direction. Schopenhauer's views on women are controversial territory." Elizabeth felt her jaw tighten. That's precisely why they need examination. These unpublished journals show dimensions of his thought that challenge our understanding. The university prefers research with broader appeal, he suggested, perhaps something more aligned with contemporary feminist philosophy. As the dean walked away, Elizabeth recognized the familiar pattern, a man defining what was appropriate for her to study, even as she explored texts about the constraints placed on women's intellectual freedom. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was experiencing the very power dynamics Schopenhauer had observed, the suppression of will through social control. The conference room in Berlin buzzed with anticipation as Elizabeth prepared to present her findings. Scholars from across Europe had gathered to hear about the discovered journals. Schopenhauer writes that women, more acutely than men, understand that perception shapes reality, Elizabeth explained to the audience. He observed that women navigated a world where others' perceptions of them determined their opportunities, their safety, even their survival. In the front row, Professor Sophia Chen nodded in recognition. Later, over dinner, she confided in Elizabeth. "Your research resonates with me," Sophia said. "As women in academia, we still experience this reality, being seen through others' perceptions rather than on our own terms." Elizabeth sipped her wine thoughtfully. Schopenhauer believed this awareness gave women a particular kind of psychological insight, the ability to read social situations and adapt to them. A survival mechanism, Sophia added, one that's still necessary. Back in her hotel room, Elizabeth stood before the mirror, considering her own reflection. She had dressed carefully for her presentation, knowing appearances still mattered in academic credibility. How much of her behavior was authentic expression and how much was performance for others' perception? She opened Schopenhauer's journal to a passage she'd marked, "The woman who learns to distinguish between how she is seen and who she truly is gains a power that transcends social limitation." Elizabeth wondered if she had achieved that distinction in her own life. Rain pelted the windows of Elizabeth's office as she transcribed a particularly difficult passage from Schopenhauer's journal. Her graduate assistant, Michael, brought her tea. "Schopenhauer contradicts himself here," Elizabeth said, pointing to the page. "In his published work, he argues that women have less capacity for justice and fairness, but in these private writings, he acknowledges women's greater capacity for compassion as a form of ethical reasoning." Michael leaned closer to see. "Is he suggesting compassion is a valid moral framework?" "Exactly," Elizabeth replied. "He's recognizing that compassion, often dismissed as feminine emotion, might actually be a more fundamental ethical principle than abstract justice." Later that evening, Elizabeth received a call from her sister, Catherine. "Mum's had a fall," Catherine said, her voice strained. "She'll be okay, but she needs care for a few weeks." Elizabeth felt the familiar tension rise. Her research deadline loomed, the department already questioning her focus. "I'll come tomorrow," she said without hesitation. As she packed her bag, she thought about Schopenhauer's paradox. Compassion often required sacrifice of individual will, yet, somehow, making that choice felt like the most authentic expression of her own will. 2 weeks later, sitting beside her sleeping mother, transcribing journals by lamplight, Elizabeth realized she wasn't experiencing this as a sacrifice at all, but as a different manifestation of her purpose, connecting philosophical inquiry to the reality of human experience and care. The university garden provided a peaceful setting for Elizabeth's meeting with her graduate students. Amidst blooming summer flowers, they discussed Schopenhauer's views on determinism. In his journals, Elizabeth explained, Schopenhauer explores how women's choices were predetermined by social structures, yet he observed that many still experienced a profound sense of agency within those constraints. Rachel, a promising doctoral student, looked up from her notes. That's still relevant today. Women often face narrower options, but are judged as though we have complete freedom of choice. Elizabeth nodded. Schopenhauer believed all humans live with this tension, the feeling of free will, despite forces shaping our options. But he observed that women's experience made this contradiction more visible. After the seminar, James approached her as she gathered her papers. "The tenure committee is split on your case," he said quietly. "Some feel your Schopenhauer research is too niche." Elizabeth felt her chest tighten. "Translation, too female-focused. I'm fighting for you," James assured her, "but you might consider publishing something from your earlier work on epistemology." Elizabeth watched him walk away, contemplating the illusion of choice in her own career. Publish what excited her intellect, or what would secure her position. The decision felt both completely her own and entirely constrained by circumstances beyond her control. That evening, reading Schopenhauer by lamplight, she found a passage that resonated. "The greatest freedom exists not in escaping constraints, but in recognizing them clearly and making choices with full awareness of the forces that shape us." Winter descended on Frankfurt as Elizabeth visited the sites of Schopenhauer's life for her research. Standing outside his former residence, she felt a peculiar connection to the philosopher who had lived there 2 centuries earlier. In his journals, Schopenhauer had written extensively about solitude, his own self-imposed isolation, and his observations about women's experiences of aloneness. Women's solitude was different from men's, he had noted. For a man, solitude was often a chosen condition for intellectual pursuit. For a woman, it frequently represented social failure or rejection. Elizabeth's phone buzzed with a message from Dean Richardson. "Committee needs publication timeline. Decision by month's end." The pressure of her tenure case felt distant here in the snow-covered streets where Schopenhauer had walked. She turned off her phone and entered a small cafe to warm herself. At a corner table, she opened the journal to Schopenhauer's most vulnerable entry, his confession of profound loneliness despite his philosophical embrace of solitude. "Perhaps this is the most fundamental human suffering," he had written, "to be simultaneously unable to tolerate complete solitude and complete connection." Elizabeth felt the weight of her own isolation, the price of her intellectual pursuits. Her colleagues respected her work, but kept their distance from its controversial nature. Her family loved her, but didn't understand her passion for philosophy. Her romantic relationships had all eventually faltered under the demands of her career. Yet, in this moment of solitude in a foreign city, connecting across centuries with another solitary mind, she felt a strange sense of communion. Perhaps true connection wasn't found in escaping solitude, but in recognizing it as the condition we all share. The museum gallery housed a collection of 19th-century portraits that Elizabeth had come to study. Schopenhauer's journals contained extensive reflections on beauty and its relationship to will and desire. "Beauty," he had written, "functions differently in the lives of women and men. For men, beauty in others serves as motivation. For women, beauty serves as both power and prison." Elizabeth studied a portrait of a young woman from Schopenhauer's era, elaborately dressed, her expression a careful mask of serene beauty. What thoughts had existed behind that composed face? Impressive collection, isn't it? Elizabeth turned, to find an attractive man in his 40s standing beside her. "David Mercer," he introduced himself, "art historian. I'm giving a lecture here tomorrow on feminine representation in 19th-century portraiture." Their conversation flowed easily from art to philosophy. When he invited her to dinner, Elizabeth accepted, surprising herself. Over candlelight, she found herself consciously arranging her expression, modulating her voice, presenting herself as both intellectual and feminine, aware of the performance even as she engaged in it. "You're studying Schopenhauer's unpublished works?" David asked. "I'd love to hear more." As she shared her research, Elizabeth noticed his interest seemed genuine, but she couldn't help analyzing their interaction through Schopenhauer's lens: the subtle power dynamics, the presentation of self, the interplay of intellect and attraction. Later, declining his invitation to extend the evening, Elizabeth walked back to her hotel, contemplating how even she, a scholar studying these very dynamics, had engaged in the complex dance of attraction, measuring her words and gestures by their effect. Schopenhauer had written that awareness of these dynamics did not free one from them, a truth she was living firsthand. The university library's rare manuscript room was eerily quiet as Elizabeth examined the most disturbing section of Schopenhauer's journals, his observations on violence against women in 19th century society. "The most profound violence," he had written, "is not physical force, but enforced silence, the systematic denial of voice and experience." Elizabeth's research assistant, Layla, helped her catalogue the references. "This is powerful stuff," Layla whispered. "He's acknowledging structural violence centuries before the concept was formalized." Elizabeth nodded. Yet he never published these thoughts. He recognized the truth, but kept his insight private, participating in the very silence he criticized. That afternoon, Elizabeth attended a faculty meeting where the department's hiring priorities were being discussed. When she advocated for a position in feminist philosophy, several male colleagues exchanged glances. "We need to prioritize areas with more universal appeal," one said dismissively. Elizabeth felt the familiar tightness in her throat, the physical manifestation of enforced silence. She thought of all the women philosophers whose work had been marginalized throughout history, deemed too particular, too feminine, not universal enough. "Schopenhauer," she said clearly, breaking the momentary silence, "observed that what we call universal in philosophy has historically meant male experience presented as neutral. Perhaps it's time we question that assumption." The room fell uncomfortably quiet. Elizabeth felt both vulnerable and powerful, understanding viscerally what Schopenhauer had meant about voice as a form of resistance. Later, in her office, she received an email from the dean requesting a meeting. About her confrontational approach in departmental discussions, the violence of silence continued, she realized, just in more sophisticated forms. Elizabeth's tenure decision loomed 1 week away as she gave her most important lecture on Schopenhauer's hidden insights. The auditorium was packed. News of her discoveries had spread throughout philosophical circles. Schopenhauer's private writings reveal a man in conflict with himself, Elizabeth explained. His published works often expressed conventional misogyny, while his journals show a deeper understanding of gender dynamics and female psychology. She projected a journal entry onto the screen. "Perhaps the greatest courage a woman can possess is the courage to speak truth in a world designed to silence her. And perhaps the greatest failure of masculine philosophy is its unwillingness to hear such truths." A senior professor raised his hand. "Are you suggesting we excuse Schopenhauer's public misogyny because of these private thoughts?" "Not at all," Elizabeth replied. "I'm suggesting we gain a more complex understanding of how even great thinkers both perpetuate and resist the prejudices of their time, often simultaneously. Schopenhauer's contradiction mirrors our own ongoing struggles with gender and philosophy." After the lecture, Elizabeth found James waiting. "Brilliant presentation," he said. "But I've heard from the committee. It's not looking good for tenure." Elizabeth felt a strange calm. "Because my work challenges the canonical reading of a major philosopher?" "Because it makes people uncomfortable," James admitted. "They call it advocacy rather than scholarship." "Truth," often makes people uncomfortable, Elizabeth said, gathering her papers. Schopenhauer understood that. So do I. For the first time in months, she felt complete clarity about her path forward, whether it included tenure or not. The small gathering at Elizabeth's apartment celebrated the publication of her first articles on Schopenhauer's journals. Her friends and supporters from the department had brought wine and congratulations. To Elizabeth, James toasted, who reminds us that philosophy should unsettle as much as it enlightens. As conversations flowed around her, Elizabeth slipped away to her study for a moment of quiet reflection. On her desk sat the tenure rejection letter alongside offers from 3 other universities eager to support her groundbreaking research. She opened Schopenhauer's journal to an entry she'd read countless times. "We do not see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. This is both the limitation and the freedom of human perception." Elizabeth thought about how her own experiences had shaped her reading of Schopenhauer's words. Would a male scholar have noticed the same passages, drawn the same conclusions? How much of her research was discovery, and how much was creation? Perhaps this was the ultimate insight in Schopenhauer's forbidden observations, that objectivity was itself an illusion, that all knowledge was positioned knowledge, viewed through the lens of one's own experience. Her contemplation was interrupted by Sophia, who had flown in from Berlin for the celebration. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" Sophia asked, joining her at the window. "How much of my work is objective analysis, and how much is my own reflection?" Elizabeth admitted. Sophia smiled. "That tension is what makes your work valuable. You're not just analyzing Schopenhauer, you're creating a dialogue across centuries." Elizabeth nodded, understanding that she had become part of the philosophical conversation she was studying, not just observing it, but participating in it, changing it through her engagement. The Cambridge debate hall was filled to capacity as Elizabeth prepared to defend her interpretation of Schopenhauer against Professor Richard Holman, the leading traditional scholar of Schopenhauer's work. "These journals," Holman argued, "are interesting historical artifacts, but they don't fundamentally change our understanding of Schopenhauer's philosophy, which must be evaluated based on his published works." Elizabeth approached the podium, feeling the weight of the moment. "Philosophy isn't just about texts," she countered. "It's about understanding how ideas develop, how thinkers struggle with contradictions, how truth emerges from tension." Their debate continued for nearly 2 hours. Intellectual opponents engaged in passionate disagreement, yet profound mutual respect. Afterward, they continued their discussion over dinner. "You've made me reconsider aspects of his work," Holman admitted, "though I still maintain his essential philosophy remains in his published writings." "Perhaps the journals don't change his philosophy," Elizabeth conceded, "but they change our understanding of him as a thinker, a man capable of recognizing truths he wasn't ready to embrace fully." As they parted ways, Elizabeth realized there was a strange intimacy in philosophical opposition, a connection formed through the serious consideration of each other's ideas. Schopenhauer had written about this paradox. We often feel more deeply connected to those who challenge us intellectually than those who merely agree. In the clash of minds, we recognize each other most fully. Elizabeth understood now that intellectual intimacy, the deep engagement with another's thoughts, was its own form of connection, different from but no less profound than emotional intimacy. Spring in Heidelberg brought cherry blossoms and notification that Elizabeth had been awarded a prestigious fellowship to complete her book on Schopenhauer's journals. Walking through the university gardens where philosophers had debated for centuries, Elizabeth contemplated legacy, Schopenhauer's and potentially her own. Her phone rang with a call from a publishing house interested in a mainstream book about her discoveries, one aimed at a general audience rather than academic philosophers. "You're Work has implications beyond philosophy, the editor explained. It speaks to contemporary questions about gender, about how progressive ideas develop even in conservative minds. Elizabeth was intrigued by the opportunity to bring philosophical insights to a broader audience, but also cautious about how her academic peers would perceive such work. Later that day, she met with several graduate students who had requested her mentorship, young women inspired by her challenge to philosophical orthodoxy. "Your approach to Schopenhauer gave me permission to question my own field's assumptions," one told her. Elizabeth realized that legacy wasn't just about published works. It was about opening paths for others, about changing how future scholars approached their subjects. Schopenhauer had written in his journal, "A philosopher's true impact may not be in the answers they provide, but in the questions they legitimize for future generations." As Elizabeth looked at the eager faces of her students, she understood that her work existed not just on paper, but in the minds she influenced and the inquiries she made possible. The International Philosophy Conference in Paris marked a turning point in Elizabeth's career. Once an outsider challenging canonical interpretations, she now gave the keynote address to colleagues who had come to respect, if not always agree with, her work. Schopenhauer's greatest insight in these private journals, she told the assembled philosophers, may be his recognition that contradiction is not failure, but the very substance of human experience. She projected his words on the screen behind her. "The contradictions in our thinking are not errors to be resolved, but accurate reflections of the contradictions inherent in existence itself." Following her talk, Elizabeth was approached by David Mercer, the art historian she had met years earlier. "I followed your work since our dinner in Frankfurt," he said. "You've transformed how we understand not just Schopenhauer, but the relationship between public philosophy and private thought." Their conversation led to dinner, then to walks along the Seine, then to a relationship that developed over subsequent months, one that surprised Elizabeth with its ease and depth. When David received an offer to curate a major exhibition in New York, Elizabeth faced the familiar conflict between relationship and career, but this time something was different. "We'll find a way to make it work," David said. "Your research matters. So does this." He gestured between them. Elizabeth thought about Schopenhauer's observation that the most profound freedom might lie not in escaping life's contradictions, but in embracing them, holding opposing truths simultaneously without trying to resolve them. Perhaps it was possible to honor both her intellectual passion and her emotional connections, not as competing forces, but as complementary dimensions of a fully realized life. The final chapter of Elizabeth's book on Schopenhauer proved the most challenging to write: how to conclude her analysis of journals that themselves had no neat conclusion, thoughts that remained in process until the philosopher's death. She worked in her office at her new university, where she had accepted a position that allowed her to expand her research while maintaining her relationship with David. Through a combination of visits and remote work, Sophia visited from Berlin, providing a fresh perspective on the manuscript. "What strikes me most," Sophia observed, "is how Schopenhauer's private writings show his growing comfort with uncertainty. The published works proclaim definitive statements about women's nature. The journals express doubts, questions, revisions." Elizabeth nodded. The older he grew, the more he seemed to embrace the unknowability of human psychology, particularly regarding gender. She turned to one of the final journal entries. "Perhaps wisdom lies not in final answers, but in increasingly sophisticated questions, not in certainty, but in the courage to remain uncertain while continuing to inquire." That evening, over dinner, with Sophia, James, visiting for a conference, and David, Elizabeth felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with resolving all questions. To questions without answers, she toasted, raising her glass. And to answers that only lead. To better questions, David added. The conversation flowed late into the night. 4 minds, engaged in the pleasure of shared inquiry without demand for conclusion. It occurred to Elizabeth that this might be Schopenhauer's most profound, forbidden insight. That wisdom wasn't about arriving at final truth, but about learning to dwell productively in uncertainty, finding meaning in the questioning itself. On a bright autumn morning, 5 years after discovering Schopenhauer's journals, Elizabeth stood in her garden, watching leaves turn the same golden color they had been when she first read those hidden pages. Her book had been published to significant acclaim, challenging and enriching philosophical understanding of Schopenhauer while opening new conversations about gender in philosophical history. More importantly, the work had transformed her own understanding, not just of Schopenhauer or philosophy, but of the complex interplay between ideas and lives, between what we think and who we are. She opened the small leather-bound journal David had given her when she completed her book, her own private space for thoughts not yet ready for public expression. She wrote, "Schopenhauer's most profound insight wasn't about female psychology specifically, but about human psychology. More broadly, the courage required to see ourselves clearly with all our contradictions and complexities." Later, teaching her seminar on philosophical methodology, Elizabeth shared with her students what she considered the most valuable lesson from her years studying the journals. The most radical philosophical act, she told them, isn't finding answers but developing the courage to question not just the world or others, but our own assumptions, our own certainties, our own selves. A student raised her hand. Is that what Schopenhauer meant by forbidden insight? The things we're afraid to know about ourselves? Elizabeth smiled, thinking of how far her understanding had evolved from that first discovery in the archives. Yes, she answered. Forbidden not by external senses, but by our own resistance to seeing ourselves clearly, with compassion, but without illusion. As class ended, Elizabeth gathered her papers, feeling the pleasant weight of the journey she had undertaken, from discovering a philosopher's hidden thoughts to discovering through that process her own capacity for growth and integration. Schopenhauer's final journal entry had read, "The ultimate courage is to see, truly see, both the world and oneself, without flinching away from either beauty or darkness." Elizabeth had come to embody that courage, not just as a scholar, but as a human being, navigating the beautiful contradictions of an examined life.